Okay, civil rights will continue during the 60s with the help and the actions of Martin Luther King. There was a violent police suppression of nonviolent protesters in Birmingham. Martin Luther King is trying to force JFK to branch out of his non-interventionist position that he's been in, not really taking action against civil rights. Wrote a letter from Birmingham jail promising action. Began with protests, public marches, demonstrations at integrating public facilities, led to a lot of police harassment and arrests. May 3rd, 6,000 children will march in place of those protesters and met with clubs, snarling dogs, fire hoses that could take the bark off of trees, tear gas, electric cattle prods, met by a lot of force. And this is televised. JFK labeled civil rights as a moral issue and will promise action on June 11th. It was nationally televised speech. Voting rights, other legislation, things were quickly followed. More students are going to start to protest in the hopes to get more action started in the legislative part of it. Kennedy is going to intervene on the side of African Americans trying to intervene and reach a settlement with civic leaders in Birmingham, calling for action after watching the horrifying events on TV. Calls for the civil rights public places and voting rights, to have the civil rights laws, activists trying to end demonstrations, trying to keep people safe while they work on the legal side of it. Martin Luther King is going to lead a march on Washington. Over 200,000 people marched. It was on the 100-year commemoration of the Emancipation Proclamation, and they met at a rally in front of the Lincoln Memorial, and the rally will end with Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. Kennedy overall had a kind of disappointing record. Legislation was on its way but never really reached its full promise. Housing discrimination ended up only affecting federal funding houses. Better voting rights by 1964. Ultimately, he will be effective, and a lot of it is because his ideas were later passed under Johnson. All right, with Supreme Court, defendants' rights in court case or criminal cases. The court was really busy in the 60s. Earl Warren was quite the Supreme Court justice. Judges were arguing for social reform, wanted traditional rights to the accused, federal courts that were already in place in state and local courts. A few court cases, such as Gideon versus Wainwright, giving lawyers to those who can't afford it. Escobedo versus Illinois and Miranda versus Arizona, suspects have to be informed of their rights. Baker versus Carr, ending the overrepresentation for rural areas, one man, one vote. And educating the poor and ignorant on constitutional rights to make them available and just as legally informed as those who are wealthy. Legislative reapportionment of states trying to go along with that, establishing one man, one vote, ruled that Tennessee had to redistribute their legislative seats to equal representation. Greater social justice was one of the things they were trying to achieve, protecting the rights of the underprivileged and to protect dissent and free expression. On November 22nd, was the president rode in a motorcade in downtown Dallas. Went to Texas to promote unity among the Democrats in preparation for the 64 elections that were coming up, his re-election. And he was assassinated by Lee Harvey Oswald. The nation was watching as their symbol of hope and promise fell, and the killing of the president, who the assassin was later then killed by Jack Ruby 2 days later. LBJ is going to promise to continue Kennedy's programs. He ultimately wants to exceed his record on economic and racial equality. Chief Justice Earl Warren said that that Lee Harvey Oswald was a lone assassin, but there are some conspiracy theories. More information is going to come out in a few years about all of this. But as Johnson takes over, asked Congress to enact his tax and civil rights bill as a tribute to him, saying, "Don't let him die in vain." In retrospect, his presidency was inspired. Many idealistic young Americans take seriously his inaugural address. His belligerent Cold War policies brought a lot of criticism, but ultimately he will be remembered fondly. Lyndon B. Johnson has a very poor image on television. He's not as polished, came across as kind of untrustworthy, clever, calculating, but he was an effective manager of Congress. He had a vast knowledge of it. He had 30 years of knowledge and experience as a legislative aide, congressman, and senator. Relied on his ties to help broker deals in Congress. Uses a lot of shrewd manipulation of senators. In spring 1964, he's going to get Kennedy's tax cut passed. It did lower the budget a little, reduce personal income taxes by more than $10 billion, and sustained an economic growth period. Consumer spending is going to increase by about $43 billion, and more jobs are going to open up. Also gets the Civil Rights Act passed. Compromises were not allowed with Johnson. Established banning of public segregation and protecting voting rights. Johnson's also going to launch a war on poverty. He has about 61% of the popular vote in the election. He set up the Office of Economic Opportunity and Head Start for preschoolers, Job Corps for high school dropouts. He wanted a cause of his own. He wanted to win the presidency on his own right. His several groups, African Americans, the elderly, households headed up by women, focusing on that nearly half of the nation is living in poverty, and the poor were invisible. They lived in slums, depressed areas. Like Appalachian was a vicious cycle. So he's encouraging self-help, government providing money and education so the poor could reap the benefits. Daycare centers, consumer education classes, legal aid services, adult remedial reading programs, and wants to reduce poverty. Funding was never high enough to reach all the goals, but does reduce the ranks of the poor by nearly 10 million from 64 to 67. Provided anti-poverty agency with $1 billion budget. Johnson won a landslide against Barry Goldwater. He won using a liberal reform program. His was known as the Great Society, and won 486 votes to 52. He had a TV ad all about Goldwater, portraying him as a dangerous extremist because Barry Goldwater said he might use nuclear weapons in certain situations. So they portrayed him as a dangerous choice. All right, for reform, the Great Society is going to go beyond New Deal. Healthcare and education were the top priority. Medicare, health insurance for 65 and older. Johnson knew there was a lot of opposition to a comprehensive medical program, but mandates health insurance under Social Security program for those over the age of 65. Also got rid of immigration quotas during this time. Establishes Medicaid, health care for the government funded for the poor and disabled. He also starts the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, supporting a child benefit approach, giving money to advance the education of students, providing aid to the poor districts. Gave over $1 billion in federal aid. Congress is going to pass speed limits to regulate automobile industry. One of it was based on Ralph Nader's book, Unsafe at Any Speed. There was a Voting Rights Act, 1965, banning literacy tests in states and countries in which less than half the population had voted in 1964. In states and counties where less than half the population had voted, they're going to have, voting rolls in Alabama. They have calling for action of brutal mistreatment of marchers, reforms at the national level, aged and poor now guaranteed medical care, communities seeing improved education, African Americans wanting to attend integrated schools, public facilities, and having more political power by having the right to vote with all of this. Johnson, real quick, there's a chart just showing you the registration in voters between 60 and 66. So in just about every area, there's a pretty significant increase. All right, with Vietnam, Johnson is going to escalate. Foreign policy is going to continue. At this point, there were the Hawks versus the Doves. They see Vietnam as nationalist versus communist civil war, that we shouldn't get involved, where the Doves and the Hawks were those that were pushing for greater involvement in the war. Johnson wants to continue foreign policy under Kennedy, continuing his domestic reforms. He relies very heavily on his advisors. He wants to contain communism. He wants to use covert aid and open encouragement to overthrow leftist regimes in Brazil. Sends troops to the Dominican Republic, 20,000 to protect tourists, to lists of suspected communists among rebel leaders, and ends with an election of a conservative government there. He's determined not to, quote-unquote, lose Vietnam to the communists, trying to uphold his policies the more he found himself under attack. In Vietnam, at this point, there was just under 3 million people that are going to serve in this war altogether. 1964, Saigon was on the verge of collapse. Diem's overthrow had left kind of a political vacuum at this point. 7 governments had ruled in South Vietnam. Power changed hands 3 times in 1 month. And Johnson's initial response was going to be economic aid, sent an additional $50 million, 7,000 more military advisors to train the Vietnamese, create these hamlets or fortified villages, covert actions, including raids on the north. In August 1964, there's also going to be the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. This is an important one to know. The North Vietnamese at this point had used their torpedo boats to attack the Maddox, an American destroyer. Also sent another destroyer at that point and opened fire on North Vietnamese gunboats as a retaliation of airstrikes and naval airstrikes. We secure congressional authority to go into combat with this Gulf of Tonkin resolution. Johnson had asked Congress to pass him a resolution to authorize him to take all necessary measures to repel any armed attack against the U.S. Even though he had already countered the attack or ordered the attack, a lot of his critics accused him of just wanting a blank check from Congress to escalate the war, which is basically what he gets. Only 2 voted against it, and his popularity goes way up with this policy. He had no intention of widening the conflict, but it does give him the ability to use whatever force he needs. He's going to approve Operation Rolling Thunder, an air attack with B-52 bombers against North Vietnam, and it was the first use of combat troops against the Viet Cong. Later, it's referred to as an illegal war. So full-scale escalation began in 1965. After advice from McNamara and Joint Chiefs, LBJ escalates the number of troops dramatically, known as Americanization, promised open-ended support for the war to save South Vietnam, allowed for increased bombing in North Vietnam. The U.S. effort is going to intend to bring Hanoi into peace negotiations. Johnson settles on a gradual increase of the bombing of North Vietnam, approves immediate dispatch of 50,000 troops to Vietnam, and commits 50,000 more in the future to protect Saigon. It was supposed to compel them to a diplomatic solution. He had opened an open-ended commitment of military support from the U.S., and it was the closest thing we had to a formal declaration of war. It was limited, committing about 500,000 Americans. At this point, we have Pleiku, which was Viet Cong attack against the U.S. air base, authorized the attacks that one known as Operation Rolling Thunder on North Vietnam. We have a policy of secrecy and deceit to assure Americans of Vietnam insignificance, refusing to acknowledge that he had engaged America in a very dangerous military involvement, a lot of misinformation, a lot of secrecy, and so it leads to a credibility gap that's not going to leave him very popular in the long run. Stalemate. In 1968, we have about 500,000 U.S. troops in Vietnam, succeed only in preventing a communist victory. The Viet Cong were still controlling a lot of the countryside. In the north, we'd bombed Ho Chi Minh Trail. In the south, we increased ground support. This became a war of attrition. It increases our losses and rages the South Vietnamese. We were hoping to eventually reach a point when the communist losses outnumbered their recruits. We used search and destroy tactics. The Viet Cong waged a war of insurgency, avoid any kind of fixed position. They'd ambush and strike. A lot of it was devastating the countryside, causing a lot of civilian casualties, driving the people into the guerrillas' favor. In 1963, we have the Tet Offensive. This was Tet is the Lunar New Year, and the Viet Congs launch a surprise attack. A lot of heavy U.S. losses, but we will take back the territory. The victory kind of demoralizes the U.S. People watch on the TV. They lose a lot of the support for the war. Johnson announced that he's going to end up scaling back the war effort and look for efforts of peace. Joint Chiefs wanted 200 more, but old Cold War diplomats encouraged to scale back, and he announced he's going to start limiting the bombings and start to work on negotiating peace. U.S. troop levels in Vietnam are going to start to drop. All right, for the home front with all of this, there's a lot of unrest at home. The youth of America were protesting. We have the development of the counterculture, reaction to materialism, and this alternative lifestyle. We continue the escalation of the Vietnam War. A lot of discontent on campuses, college riots, people looking to the streets to voice their discontent.